John Marshall was the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. His court opinions helped lay the basis for United States constitutional law, and many say made the Supreme Court of the United States a co-equal branch of government along with the legislative and executive branches. Previously, Marshall had been a leader of the Federalist Party in Virginia and served in the United States House of Representatives from 1799 to 1800. He was Secretary of State under President John Adams from 1800 to 1801, the longest-serving Chief Justice and the fourth longest-serving justice in U.S. Supreme Court history. Marshall dominated the court for over 3 decades and played a significant role in the development of the American legal system. Most notably, he reinforced the principle that federal courts are obligated to exercise judicial review by disregarding purported laws if they violate the Constitution. Thus, Marshall cemented the position of the American judiciary as an independent and influential branch of government. Furthermore, Marshall's court made several important decisions relating to federalism, affecting the balance of power between the federal government and the states during the early years of the Republic. In particular, he repeatedly confirmed the supremacy of federal law over state law, and supported an expansive reading of the enumerated powers. Some of his decisions were unpopular. Nevertheless, Marshall built up the third branch of the federal government, and augmented federal power in the name of the Constitution and the rule of law. Marshall, along with Daniel Webster, was the leading Federalist of the day, pursuing Federalist Party approaches to build a stronger federal government over the opposition of the Jeffersonian Republicans, who wanted stronger state governments. Early years. John Marshall was born in a log cabin in Germantown, a rural community on the Virginia frontier, in what is now Fauquier County, near Midland, on September 24, 1755, to Thomas Marshall and Mary Isham Keith, the granddaughter of Thomas Randolph of Tuckahoe. The oldest of 15, John had 8 sisters and 6 brothers. Also, several cousins were raised with the family. From a young age, he was noted for his good humor and black eyes, which were strong and penetrating, beaming with intelligence and good nature. His younger brother, James Markham Marshall, also served briefly in a newly created judgeship for the federal judiciary on the Circuit Court of the District of Columbia from 1801 to 1803, and 3 of his brothers, Keith, William and Charles, were lawyers. Thomas Marshall was employed in Fauquier County as a surveyor and land agent by Lord Fairfax, which provided Marshall with a substantial income. In the early 1760s, the Marshall family left Germantown and moved about 30 miles to Leeds Manor on the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the banks of Goose Creek, Thomas Marshall built a wood frame house, with 2 rooms on the first floor and a 2-room loft above. Thomas Marshall was not yet well established, so he leased it from Colonel Richard Henry Lee. The Marshalls called their new home the Hollow, and the 10 years they resided there were John Marshall's formative years. In 1773, the Marshall family moved once again. Thomas Marshall, by then a man of substantial means, purchased an estate adjacent to North Cobbler Mountain in Delaplane. The new farm was located adjacent to the main stage road between Salem and Delaplane. When John was 17, Thomas Marshall built Oak Hill there, a 7-room frame home with 4 rooms on the first floor and 3 above. Although modest in comparison to the estates of George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, it was a substantial home for the period. John Marshall became the owner of Oak Hill in 1785 when his father moved to Kentucky. Although John Marshall lived his later life in Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., he kept his Fauquier County property, making substantial improvements to the house until he transferred the property as a wedding present to his eldest son Thomas in 1809. Marshall's early education was superintended by his father, who gave him an early taste for history and poetry. Thomas Marshall's employer, Lord Fairfax, allowed access to his home at Greenway Court, which was an exceptional centre of learning and culture. Marshall took advantage of the resources at Greenway Court and borrowed freely from the extensive collection of classical and contemporary literature. There were no schools in the region at the time, so homeschooling was pursued. Although books were a rarity for most in the territory, Thomas Marshall's library was exceptional. His collection of literature, some of which was borrowed from Lord Fairfax, was relatively substantial and included works by the ancient Roman historian Livy, the ancient Roman poet Horace, and the English writers Alexander Pope, John Dryden, John Milton, and William Shakespeare. All of the Marshall children were accomplished, literate, and self-educated under their parents' supervision. At the age of 12, John had transcribed Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man and some of his moral essays. There being no formal school in Fauquier County at the time, John was sent, at age 14, about 100 miles from home to an academy in Washington Parish. Among his classmates was James Monroe, the future president. John remained at the academy 1 year, after which he was brought home. Afterward, Thomas Marshall arranged for a minister to be sent who could double as a teacher for the local children. The Reverend James Thompson, a recently ordained deacon from Glasgow, Scotland, resided with the Marshall family and tutored the children in Latin in return for his room and board. When Thompson left at the end of the year, John had begun reading and transcribing Horace and Livy. The Marshalls had long before decided that John was to be a lawyer. William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England had been published in America, and Thomas Marshall bought a copy for his own use and for John to read and study. After John returned home from Campbell's Academy, he continued his studies with no other aid than his dictionary. John's father superintended the English part of his education. Marshall wrote of his father, "And to his care I am indebted for anything valuable which I may have acquired in my youth. He was my only intelligent companion, and was both a watchful parent and an affectionate friend." Marshall served in the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War and was friends with George Washington. He served first as a lieutenant in the Culpeper Minutemen from 1775 to 1776, and went on to serve as a lieutenant and then a captain in the 11th Virginia Continental Regiment from 1776 to 1780. During his time in the Army, he enjoyed running races with the other soldiers and was nicknamed Silver Heels for the white heels his mother had sewn into his stockings. Marshall endured the brutal winter conditions at Valley Forge. After his time in the Army, he read law under the famous Chancellor George Wythe at the College of William and Mary, was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and was admitted to the bar in 1780. He was in private practice in Fauquier County before entering politics. Political career. In 1782, Marshall won a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates, in which he served until 1789 and again from 1795 to 1796. The Virginia General Assembly elected him to serve on the Council of State later in the same year. In 1785, Marshall took up the additional office of Recorder of the Richmond City Hustings Court. In 1788, Marshall was selected as a delegate to the Virginia Convention responsible for ratifying or rejecting the United States Constitution, which had been proposed by the Philadelphia Convention a year earlier. Together with James Madison and Edmund Randolph, Marshall led the fight for ratification. He was especially active in defense of Article 3, which provides for the federal judiciary. His most prominent opponent at the ratification convention was anti-federalist leader Patrick Henry. Ultimately, the convention approved the Constitution by a vote of 89 to 79. Marshall identified with the New Federalist Party, and opposed Jefferson's Republican Party. Meanwhile, Marshall's private law practice continued to flourish. He successfully represented the heirs of Lord Fairfax in Hyde v. Fairfax, an important Virginia Supreme Court case involving a large tract of land in the northern neck of Virginia. In 1796, he appeared before the United States Supreme Court in another important case, Ware v. Hilton, a case involving the validity of a Virginia law providing for the confiscation of debts owed to British subjects. Marshall argued that the law was a legitimate exercise of the state's power. However, the Supreme Court ruled against him, holding that the Treaty of Paris in combination with the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution required the collection of such debts. Henry Flanders, in his biography of Marshall, remarked that Marshall's argument in Ware v. Hilton elicited great admiration at the time of its delivery, and enlarged the circle of his reputation. Flanders also wrote that the reader cannot fail to be impressed with the vigor, rigorous analysis, and close reasoning that mark every sentence of it. In 1795, Marshall declined Washington's offer of Attorney General of the United States and, in 1796, declined to serve as minister to France. In 1797, he accepted when President John Adams appointed him to a three-member commission to represent the United States in France. However, when the envoys arrived, the French refused to conduct diplomatic negotiations unless the United States paid enormous bribes. This diplomatic scandal became known as the XYZ affair, inflaming anti-French opinion in the United States. Hostility increased even further when the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand refused to negotiate with Marshall and Pinckney, prompting their departure from France in April 1798. Marshall's handling of the affair, as well as public resentment toward the French, made him popular with the American public when he returned to the United States. In 1798, Marshall declined a Supreme Court appointment, recommending Bushrod Washington, who would later become one of Marshall's staunchest allies on the court. In 1799, Marshall reluctantly ran for a seat in the United States House of Representatives. Although his congressional district favored the Democratic-Republican Party, Marshall won the race, in part due to his conduct during the XYZ affair and in part due to the support of Patrick Henry. His most notable speech was related to the case of Thomas Nash, whom the government had extradited to Great Britain on charges of murder. On May 7, 1799, President Adams nominated Congressman Marshall as Secretary of War. However, on May 12, Adams withdrew the nomination, instead naming him Secretary of State, as a replacement for Timothy Pickering. Confirmed by the United States Senate on May 13, Marshall took office on June 6, 1800. As Secretary of State, Marshall directed the negotiation of the Convention of 1800, which ended the quasi-war with France and brought peace to the new nation.